Year two in the Damon Stoudemire era at Georgia Tech. And I think this is a very sneaky team. Christian here with Nick, and we've got Chad Bishop, who covers Georgia Tech for the Atlanta Journal and Constitution. Chad, tell us, what is the vibe of this fan base? Is the optimism that I'm feeling? Are they feeling it there? I feel like they must be.
I think so. I've been telling folks this summer, if they were to pick an NCAA tournament team today, I think Tech's a bubble team, right? Like they're going to be in the discussion to make the tournament as an at-large. I think with what they did last year, excuse me, what they did last year, with who they have coming back, with the success that Damon Stoudemire showed in year one, I think year two is the year for them to take that next step and to make that NCAA tournament. I mean, that's the goal. Damon Stoudemire said it last year. I mean, he wanted to make the NCAA tournament in year one, and they fell short. But beat Duke, won on the road at Virginia, beat a ranked Mississippi State team. They got to be more consistent and beat some of the teams at the bottom of the standings. But again, with what they have coming back and the program they have in place, the recruits they have coming in, I think this could be a dangerous team in the ACC.
For sure. I'm with Chris and yourself. Like I love this team this season. I rated them pretty highly. You kind of talked about their ceiling last season, just some of the big wins they had. And I agree completely. They need to find a little bit more consistency. And I think in year two with Stoudemire, they certainly will. So let's just talk about the starting five. Some key players then. JV McCollum, big get. Luke O'Brien, a little bit more under the radar, but me and Chris are both fond of him from Colorado. So let's just kind of talk about the starting five and some key players.
I think you start with the two biggest returnees, right? Guys who were freshmen last year, and Nate George and Bai Dongo. Nowadays in college sports, right? Not only do you have to recruit incoming players, you got to recruit your own players. So to keep those guys on the roster, keep them in house, I think is big first and foremost. Then you look at a guy like Lance Terry, who redshirted last year, had some leg issues, did not play. He's coming back, so expect him to compete for a starting job. Could be an integral part to this lineup. And then JV McCollum from Oklahoma. Duncan Powell, a guy who's been at Sacramento State, North Carolina A&T. You mentioned Luke O'Brien from Colorado. They got some pieces and they got some depth. And then you bring in, the freshmen and Jaden Mustaf, Darian Sutton, Doran Onwu-Chekwa, three pretty highly ranked recruits coming in to sort of help the depth and help the youth movement of this team. And then I didn't even mention Kawasi Reeves, who was a big part of last year's team as well. So again, the depth is improved, the talent is improved. We went to practice, I believe it was back in August, and you could see just sort of a faster team, maybe a 5-on-5 team, right? Like where if you put in the backups, there's not going to be a huge drop off. So I think that's key. I wouldn't be so concerned with maybe the starting lineup with this team as maybe who is 6, 7, 8, 9, right? And who are those guys coming off the bench? If those guys are next level, that's going to help this team overall as well.
100%. And if you're going to be 14 and 18, like the fact that I couldn't have drawn up a better 14 and 18 year, truly, right? Like to get.
Are you saying they were the best 14 and 18 team in the country?
1,000%. Like, yes, you would have liked to be in the Louisvilles and the Notre Dames of the world. Well, Notre Dame got better at the end of the season, but the fact that I think that's really a testament to just the talent this group has and to Stoudemire as a coach. So when you look at this talent, Dongo's a guy that could get drafted after this year. I'm very on him. He's super athletic, and the way that he plays, I think, in the addition of Luke O'Brien, there's some very interesting spacing, I think, with this team can do, because Luke O'Brien's a guy that he can post up a bit, he can pass the ball, and he can shoot it at a big size. He can guard multiple positions. And then George, was young last year. He had a lot of responsibility as a ball handler. I think him and McCollum together is a great backcourt duo of I just think they'll play off each other well. And then Reeves is a guy that, early on in his career, he couldn't really shoot, but he shot 38% from deep last year. So, you mentioned Terry as a guy that could enter the fold. I really like that top six. I didn't know about Terry's injury, so it's good to hear that he's in the mix. But of those guys you mentioned, of Mustaf, Sutton, and Onwu-Chekwa, what have you been hearing about them? Are they guys that you think can fill in that 7, 8, 9 on this team?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because Georgia Tech's got this little feeder program now here in Atlanta, Overtime Elite, where they seem to be funneling a lot of their recruits through that system. And that academy, those guys are playing against, D1 talent day in and day out. So I think for sure Jaden Mustaf and Darian Sutton are two guys who can come in. I'm not saying they're playing 15 minutes a game, but they're going to get their playing time and they're going to compete for some minutes. And I think it's going to be good for them to learn behind a guy like Javian McCollum and a guy like Nate George playing in the front court. It's interesting to hear Damon Stoudemire talk this offseason. He said, hey, we're playing 2 point guards. That's what we're doing. We're going to play Javian McCollum and Nate George side by side. It's something you don't see a ton, but it's something that Damon Stoudemire experienced when he was a player in college. So he's going to run with that first and foremost. But at some point, one of those guys is going to need a rest. And that's probably Jaden Mustaf coming in to fill in the shoes for Nate George or Davian McCollum if those guys go out for a spell. So that's going to be big. I saw Jaden Mustaf play a few times over at Overtime Elite. He's a very, very solid basketball player. Has room to grow, of course, but I think he's going to help them immediately. So, again, recruiting has been next level for Damon Stoudemire. He knows it. I think that maybe is what separates him from some other former NBA guys who try to coach at the college level. Stoudemire seems to understand you have to recruit 24/7. He's done that since he's got here, and I think you've seen that in the results.
Is the identity of this team going into year two? You mentioned they're playing 2 point guards at the same time. Is the identity more of like a small ball game? Because, you look at the roster, Duncan Powell's a good 5, but he's a little bit undersized as a 5-man. Mutombo's kind of a question mark. So are they just kind of like embracing the small ball? Like, do you think the tempo uptick this season, or will anything be different drastically from last season in that regard?
Yeah, I think for now, I think in year two, you're right. I mean, they don't have a true 5 or even a true backup 5. And it's crazy to me because, I look at that North Carolina game last year that Georgia Tech won, and Bai Dongo went out early with a concussion, and they didn't have anybody to match up with North Carolina's size, and they still won that game. And the same thing with beating Clemson in overtime on the road at Clemson. I mean, Clemson was a team with tremendous size. So, I don't know if Damon Stoudemire would necessarily call it small ball, right? But it is. I mean, they don't have these 7-footers down low, these 7'2", 6'11" big men to really mash bodies with the rest of the ACC. But it seems to be working. I think the one thing that Damon Stoudemire is concerned about, is defense. He needs this defense to be so much better in year two than it was in year one. Defense is better. That helps transition. That helps these guys get out on the run and score a lot of points. So I think that's what he would like to see in year two, because that wasn't necessarily there week in and week out in year one. And that's why probably you see maybe a little bit smaller of a lineup than the rest of the ACC.
Back to Dongo and the NBA buzz. Is that something is there a expectation in the program that this might be his last year and that he does have, a big step that he's going to take this year?
I don't know if that's the expectation, but I think that's what Damon Stoudemire wants. The kid went to some camps over the summer. He's been in NBA circles. I know, talking to Georgia Tech folks, they want to get Bai and Dongo in front of the media a lot more. I think that's telling this season, like, hey, I think he could be a guy that shows up at ACC Media Day. Like, hey, if you're going to go pro, if you're going to go to the next level, you got to be in front of the camera. You got to talk to the media. So I think there's no bones about that, right? Like, as a college coach, you want to tell your guys, hey, I want to get you to the pros, right? That's the end game. That's my job as a coach. And so I think that is definitely the end goal for Bai and Dongo and for Damon Stoudemire, to say you need to take your game to the next level. If you want to play at the next level, you got to improve. I think they're very guarded against that sophomore slump. I mean, Damon Stoudemire alluded to it this summer. Like, it's going to be hard for these freshmen, Nate George and Bai Dongo, to play the way they played last year again in year two. But that's the challenge, because if they can do that, they'll put themselves in the position to get NBA looks. So I think Bai Dongo's definitely trending toward that direction. But again, he's got to do it consistently. He's got to play better defense, just like the entire team. And if he does that, with how he scores offensively, I think he'll get a look from NBA scouts for sure.
Yeah, I love that. I think retaining him and bringing him back was huge. And it's just a testament to the culture that Stoudemire is building here. And I agree with what you said. I think, heading to the season, that Georgia Tech is a bubble team. Do we know the last time Georgia Tech was in the tournament?
With the COVID year with Alvarado, right?
That's right. Yeah, 20.
Was this right? Couldn't play.
Yeah, they it was before my time, but they won the ACC tournament that year to get in. And if memory serves, they had to go to Indianapolis, where I think most of the tournament was held, right, and had to play Butler. So it's basically a road game.
Loyola, and then Loyola went on to beat Illinois.
Yeah. So it's been a few years and definitely had a dip, in the standings in the program. But that's why they brought Damon Stoudemire in. Like I said, his goal is to get to the tournament. He wants to make this a tournament team. He's not satisfied with finishing 8th or 9th or having a winning record. They want to get this team back in the tournament, and the fans are craving that as well.
So Georgia Tech, other than probably Boston College, it's got to be one of the hardest jobs in the league. I don't know. It still hasn't really resonated that Cal and Stanford are in the league, especially that the Pac-12 is back.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're going to go back or what the complications look like that. But I think the overtime elite pipeline is a thing that I never really considered. That's really interesting. And I think when you are at a school, like GT, you have to find you really have to find a lot of talent, right? Because even look at a school like Boston College, like Earl Grant brings in Quentin Post, who turns into an NBA guy and is a fantastic player. And it still wasn't enough to like really break through and get back to the tournament. So it's a tough job, but there's a lot to like about this team as we're referencing. I think starting 5, like the pieces just fit a lot. It seems like a very smart addition to as a transfer class, right? It's like, what did this team need? It needed a little bit of a veteran presence, and you bring in 2 guys from, well coached under Porter Moser and Tad Boyle, and older guys who can kind of mentor some of the younger guys. I think McCollum and George is going to be a really dynamic backcourt, and McCollum's not a guy that needs, the ball the whole time. Like he played along guys like Otego Oweh at Oklahoma who had the ball a lot too. So I'm really excited about this team. One stylistic question. Georgia Tech was 7th, bought like 56 in the country in turnovers forced last year. So that was not a thing. Do you think that's more of a stylistic thing of just playing a lot of drop coverage, or do you know if that's something that Stoudemire kind of adapted to his personnel? Do you think that number will stay super low? Because teams like Creighton and Illinois were 3 seeds last year, and they were at the bottom in the country in that too. But it was interesting for me to see Georgia Tech there.
No, I bet that keeps Damon Stoudemire up at night. I mean, defense is his middle name, and I think it really bothers him that his team was not very good defensively and didn't force a lot of turnovers. I think a lot of games that they lost, you would see Georgia Tech sort of drop back and settle into defense and not force turnovers. And, I picture those Notre Dame games they lost where Notre Dame would just milk the shot clock down to 0 and drain a 3-pointer almost every single possession. And it's just not – I just don't think it's how Damon Stoudemire wants to see his team play. I think part of that is, he brought in a roster last year he thought could compete in the ACC. And I think he realized at some point, whether that was early, halfway at the end, it had to be a better roster. It was a roster he thought could compete, and I think he might have been a little off in that assessment. And that's why he went out and got some of these other guys coming into this year to compete at a higher talent level. Nothing against the 23-24 roster, but I think he realized, all right, maybe my assessments were a little off, and I need to get some higher talent, some guys who can play a lot better defense, force a lot more turnovers, so Georgia Tech can get out and run a little bit and score a little bit more in transition. Again, he brags about his time with the Boston Celtics and how good they were defensively, how good his team at Pacific was defensively. And so I think it really bugged him last year that Georgia Tech was not great in forcing turnovers and getting in transition, getting those buckets. So I think you'll see, again, they're not going to lead the country or be maybe top 50 in that category, but there will be an increase in terms of turnovers forced, transition buckets, scoring average. I think all of that will improve in year 2 under Stoudemire.
Well, there you have it. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Chad Bishop. And we'll be in touch as the season goes along, because like I said, Nick and I are very high on this team. This is a team that I think legitimately could finish top 8 in the ACC. I think in a evolving landscape to retain young talent, to bring in some vets that fit. Those are really hard things, just those 2. I don't even need to say anything else because, a lot of teams are not in a position like that. So.
Well, man, I haven't covered an NCAA tournament game since 2012, so you better believe that I'm hoping these Yellow Jackets can get it done so I can get back to the big dance myself. It's all about me, that's what it comes down to.
Hey, as it should be. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks again for joining.
All right, guys.